Hi, everyone. It's Rob Gray from ASU and the Perception Action Podcast, again with another article review. Today's article touches on something I've been interested in a lot for a long time. In sports, with all the analytics we can do, all the sensors, everything we can measure now, we have so much information available to us that we didn't have before. In my sport, baseball, we have all the information about ball flight and things we didn't have before. Undoubtedly, in most sports, this extra information we're getting and all these analytics we're doing has had clear benefits in terms of things like strategy, evaluating players, and things like that. So we can use things to pick up a tendencies of an opponent and come up with a strategy to face them, for example. But one key question I think we haven't focused on enough, and that's really, really important, is how to actually give all of this information back to the athlete, right? So they can use it for talent development, for they can use it in games for performance itself, right? We're starting to get there. We're starting to think about that, but I think there's so many questions still to test. So this paper touches on this kind of topic in a very interesting way. And you'll see my spin, my kind of interpretation of it is very different than authors. So what we're talking about here is what Newell has called augmented information. So augmented information is any kind of information that is not normally available to us in the athlete environment relationship, right? So anything extra that we can't sense ourselves. So giving you feedback on how hard you hit a ball, for example, is augmented information. And that's a specific type of information he called in information feedback, right? So it could be feedback after the fact, like speed, or feedback during an action, right? And as I said, the key question for me is how should we be giving, what's the best way to give this to an athlete? It's probably not one answer, but what are the best kind of practices for using this to, an ecological approach? What we want to do is use this to help guide the athlete's search for an optimal solution, right? So how can we use this information to help them do that, right? Is kind of the key question. So this study looked at a interesting question within that, and looking at how much feedback, how many different sources of information should we give in terms of this augmented information. And this is by Bain and colleagues and published late last year in the Frontiers in Psychology, so it's open access. The sport they were looking at was cycling. So they were looking at time trial, and they were comparing inexperienced cyclists with experienced cyclists who happened to be triathletes, right? And their main question of interest was the whether comparing the performance for a single source of augmented information. So the task, so power, cadence, speed, right? Is it better to just give an athlete one thing they can focus on, so one source of augmented information, versus giving them a whole display of things? And anyone who's a cyclist, I cycled for a long time, knows that you can buy all kinds of things now for your bike that will give you multiple outputs of different measures, right? Power, cadence, time, sort of, right? And what the authors framed this paper in is the idea of cognitive overload, right? Multiple feedback might be detrimental to performance and learning because it's going to be overloading. Like there's too much for the athlete to take in, and that's how they framed the paper. So what they did in the study was they had 20 participants, 10 non-cyclists and 10 cyclist triathletes, as all of the cyclists had at least 2 years of competitive experience, right? They did 30-minute individual cycling. They did 2 of them, right? On separate days, separated by 5 days, on a time trial, a turbo trainer, a wind trainer, as I used to call it. So their task was a time trial. What they did was they had a 30-minute time period that they had to try to ride as far as possible. That was their goal. So that was what they did. On separate days, which is counterbalanced, they had one condition, which is shown in condition B down in the bottom there, where all they're shown is the amount of time that has elapsed, right? So they know when it's getting close to 30 minutes and it's going to run up. So they're only showing the last time. On the left is the multiple information condition. On that, they're shown heart rate. So they're showing elapsed time and distance, how far they've ridden, how much time's gone, speed, heart rate. They're also showing cadence. For those who don't know, cadence is basically what frequency you're pedaling at, whether you're pedaling at a high frequency in a relatively low gear, or a lower cadence in a high gear. They're also performing in a really, if you watch the Tour de France or anything, you'll hear the newest, not that new, but is power. What cyclists try to regulate is power output, which is a measure of kind of how many watts, how much energy you're using. So a lot of cyclists try to use that to keep that regulated. They wore eye tracker, which is one of the kind of reasons I picked this study that I think was over and above a lot of these other studies that have looked at this kind of topic. Is the cyclists wore an eye tracker so they could tell how much they were actually looking at each of these information sources, and that's why they spread it out in kind of that weird way instead of using a real device, right? A real a power meter or something like that on the bike, right? So that's the basic design. And as I said, they ran 2 days. They also separated each trial into 5-minute blocks, right? So they could measure 6 5-minute blocks, so they can measure different things. Okay, what did they find? First of all, what they found was a clear expertise effect, right? So the experts produced significantly faster, covered a greater distance, like had a higher average speed, had more power output than the less experienced cyclists. And you can see this over graph. This graph is just showing power, right? CT means cyclist triathlete, so those are experienced. MF means multiple feedback. SF means single feedback, right? So you can see the both of the solid lines, which for the experienced cyclists are above the novices, so they're producing more power. The other, so that's kind of not surprising, but the other interesting effect is they kind of got what they predicted, right? Having multiple feedback, multiple augmented information sources, having all those displays, which is the diamonds here, resulted in lower power output, significantly lower power output. I don't know why there's a dollar sign there. I can't remember. Than the single feedback, right? It also, most importantly, they've rode less distance, right? By about over half a kilometer less when they had all of those displays there than when they just had the one display with a elapsed time, okay? So very interesting finding. The other important thing you can see here, and this was true across all the variables, including distance, for the novices, there's no effect of the display condition. So there's no significant difference in their performance at all, depending on whether they had the single display or the multi-display. Okay, so some interesting effects there. What about the eye tracking? Okay, so in the eye tracking, what they did was to look at how long, the standard way you do eye tracking, area of interest, how long they looked at each of the things. And what they found was mostly they looked at the experienced cyclists. What they did for example, in the experienced cyclist, they spent most of the time looking at the power display, which is maybe not surprising given what I told you, how much of an emphasis that is now. Next most was the time, and they were very close. Then heart rate, then speed, then distance and cadence, right? And you can see how much time they were looking at it. The white dots, I think, are the averages, right? Importantly, and this is something why I think it's so important to do eye tracking research in these kind of studies. How much they looked at each of these displays was completely different than what people reported they were doing in a questionnaire, right? In the questionnaire, the experienced cyclists said they were using the speed display the most, which they're clearly not looking at it that much, right? So I have a lot of people would disagree with me. I have a healthy distrust of people's respective recall of what information they're using and what they're doing in tasks like this. I'm not a big fan of those kind of things. I know a lot of other people use them in research, but to me, this points exactly why, right? People do not have good knowledge and awareness sometimes of what they're doing, what they're looking at, what information they're taking in. The other thing they found was if you break the task into blocks, right? So here's the 30-minute time trial. You break it into 6 5-minute blocks. For some of the variables, right? This one, I think the bottom one is the power output. Maybe this is the time output on the bottom. What you can see is that they're looking at it a bit less as it goes down, especially right at the end. They're barely looking at it at all, right? They've almost stopped looking at it in the last 10 minutes of the ride, right? And overall, if you add up all the time they looked at all of the things, they decreased over time, right? So it went from 75 seconds in block 1, right, to, if you add up all, looking at all the displays, to 22 seconds in block 6. So by the time they get to the end of the ride, they're hardly looking at any of those displays at all. Okay, so those are the main findings. As I said, some interesting results. What did the authors make of this, right? So again, the main thing we're trying to explain is, why do we get this performance deficit when you give you multiple sources of information? Interestingly, note, in the multiple condition, we're actually giving you the information about the task goal that you didn't have before, right? So right, in the single condition, all you have is elapsed time. In the multiple condition, you have the elapsed distance, what you're trying to achieve, right? So I thought that was interesting. But they really frame it in terms of a cognitive load explanation. So the idea is and they point to literature. There's lots of literature on like dual task literature, some of the things I've done myself, where if you give people a secondary task, it impairs their performance on endurance tasks like cycling, running, right? It pulls out. The idea is that cognitive load pacing takes some cognitive load, some attention, some working memory strategy. If I give you something else to do, it pulls you away from it. It makes you worse, right? So that's their idea, right? This for them is why you get worse at the end of the trial, right? You're running out of resources, right? You stop using the information less at the end of the trial because you're running out of resources. Your cognitive load is overall load is getting higher and higher. Your capacity is getting lower and lower. So you can't take any information in at all. You stop looking. For them, why you don't get a difference between the two display conditions for novices or inexperienced cyclists is that pacing is something they haven't learned yet, so it hasn't been automated. So for them, even in the single feedback condition, the task is very cognitively demanding, right? They've already hit a threshold, right? So adding more displays is not going to change anything because they're already overloaded, right? So the skill hasn't been automated yet. So a very, very kind of traditional information processing explanation of why this occurred, right? For me, I would put a different spin on this, right? For a few reasons. One, I don't think the cognitive load really works for me here for a few reasons. One is, right, so they mostly use research from dual tasks to try to relate to this effect. But I would point, this is not a dual task, right? We're not giving you a secondary task that's unrelated, right, to pull your resources away. The displays are related to the primary task, right? And furthermore, the person wasn't asked to do anything with them. They could have ignored them. They didn't have to call out their heart rate or look at, right? So I don't think this is the same as giving them a counting numbers task or listening for the sound task like I've done in the past and other people, right? This is not a dual task, right? So I don't think that applies. The other thing that makes me not think this is cognitive load is if you look at how much time people were actually spending looking at the different displays, right? So I think I showed in the last slide. So they, if you add up all the looking they did at all the displays, it's 75 seconds out of 5 minutes, right? So that to me doesn't point to being overloaded, right? If you're only taking in information, I know you could be thinking about it and processing it, but to me that doesn't really suggest it. And also, I have a kind of doubts about the kind of the novice interpretation as well, but I know people would argue. To me, what this points to is, and this is a big concern I have, and I see in a lot of the ways in practice when I go to and see how, as I said, how this information is used. To me, the real danger with using all this augmented information, especially in learning, but also in performance, is a potential education of intention effect, right? So education of intention is a concept from Jacobs and Michael's direct learning theory, which I'm going to soon have a resource page and a thing you can look at for that. But I also covered an episode way back, 53 maybe. I can't remember. But the idea here is that what happens when you learn and you experience, you change your intention, the goal of what you're trying to achieve, the movement parameter you're trying to control. One of the real dangers, I think, with augmented information, depending on how we coach with it, is we can make an observer, a performer, change their intention, right? From my goal is to cover as much distance I can, is my goal is to produce this power or produce this cadence, right? we've changed the intention of the action. We've changed the affordance they're trying to achieve, right? They're no longer trying to cover as much distance. They're trying to produce the specific metric that's displayed in this augmented information. They're trying to produce this. And for me, that's likely why we get this impairment. Giving them all this information is changing this task, right? You can't regulate power, without a power display, right? So people were doing something different, using different information sources, had a different intention of how to pace what goal they were trying to achieve in that time trial when they only had the time. As soon as you give them all this other information, it changes their intention, what they're trying to realize, right? And often you can make them realize some output on a display, right? And for me, this mirrors something you see in a lot in kind of old traditional coaching, where for things like golf, where you can change the intention from trying to get the ball in the hole with as few shots, which is the goal of golf, to try to produce this technique, right? So you can shift people's attention. So I think we have to be really careful about how we give augmented information in this way, that we can change people's intention and change what they're trying to actually achieve with their movement, right? And of course, they're going to come out with a different solution. So I think this was a really interesting study, as I said, although I had a different interpretation of it. Theirs is a very standard one that I know a lot of people would agree with. But I think, as I said, we need more and more in how we should give this type of information. We need more and more studies of these types. So that's it for this article. Thanks for joining me, and cheers for now.